Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining me for talking about grief and the grief recovery method. Let me ask you a couple questions first. Have you been feeling unsettled? Are you feeling confused? Maybe do you have a sense of weariness? Are you feeling hopelessness? Well, with the shutdown, the COVID-19, we all might be experiencing some of these conflicting emotions. And odds are you could consider this to be grief. Hi, my name is Eric Van Fossen. I've been a family practice physician assistant for 28 years. Before that, I was in the Navy. I operated the nuclear power plant on a submarine, went to PA school, and then ended up joining the Army National Guard and Reserves. After 9/11, I did a combat tour in Afghanistan with a small special ops unit. For the last 5 years, I've been a hypnotist at Balanced Perceptions. And we're also, my partner and I are also certified grief recovery method specialists. I'm going to share my screen with you here. There we go. Thanks. So the grief recovery method has been in use for over 40 years. And as far as I'm aware of, it's the only evidence-based method for helping people to recover from grief. As grief recovery method specialists, we do group sessions, one-on-one sessions. We do pet loss grief recovery, and we also can do helping children with loss. Now, to be clear, we do not work directly with children, but we can work with parents, teachers, grandparents, any adult that has children in their care. And I think by the end of this little talk, it's just going to take maybe 25, 30 minutes. You're going to see why that's a really important one. So a lot of us have some real basic first aid training. A lot of us know what to do if we come across somebody with a big gash on their leg. But do you know what to do if you come across somebody with grief, a family member, or it could be a perfect stranger? What's first aid for a broken heart? Well, we're going to talk about grief and its definitions, okay? But one thing to think of is 100% of us have grief, and that grief is felt 100% for all of us. You see, there's over 40 things that can cause grief stress based on the Holmes-Rahe stress scale. And we typically think of things like divorce, death, but other things can cause a sense of loss and therefore grief. So what about pet loss, starting school, graduating from school, even death of a former spouse? Moving, that's especially a big one for kids. End of an addiction, retirement, financial changes, either positive or negative, holidays, legal trouble, a major change in your health, a loved one's dementia, and even marriage can cause a sense of loss and grief. And I know what you're thinking. You go, wait, marriage is a good thing. But actually, there's a lot of changes involved in marriage, right? So, you may lose your apartment or your house. Now you got to share finances with somebody. You can't just run out and do what you want to do when you want to do it. You got to consider other people. So there is actual change there, and that stress can cause a sense of loss and therefore grief. There's two definitions of grief that we're going to address today for our purposes. First is grief is the normal and natural reaction to a loss of any kind. And next, and this one is what applies to us, I think, right now, is that grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Now, I don't know about you, but this second one resonates with me with the stay-at-home orders and the stress of the COVID-19 pandemic. In grief recovery method, some of our aims are to always tell your truth and to always stay complete with the important people in your life. So here's parts of my truth. When I got out of the Navy, as happy as I was to be out after 6 years and get on with my life, I felt lost, confused, unsettled. And likewise, when I came home from Afghanistan, as happy as I was to be out of a combat zone, again, I was lost, confused, unsettled. I didn't know what those conflicting feelings were. I know now, with my certification in the grief recovery method, I was experiencing grief. I was experiencing loss. Not only had my normal pattern of behavior changed, but I lost the camaraderie of some of the closest best friends I'll ever have in my entire life. Now, additionally, in the last 2 years, there's been some really big changes in the dynamics of my childhood family. Um, these things caused a lot of grief for me, and to the point where I even ended up taking an antidepressant for 4 to 6 weeks. I stopped because it didn't help. It numbed me to the grief. It made me feel different, but it did not resolve the problem. So these things, my experiences, plus trying to deal with patients over 28 years, that have suffered loss, maybe they got diagnosed with a terminal illness, or somebody comes in and says, hey, my mother died last night. And even our hypnosis clients, a lot of times the root of their problem can be grief, unresolved grief. Well, I realized that I was ill prepared to deal with my own grief, much less help anybody with theirs. And that's how I arrived here today. So, what conflicting feelings caused by the end of or a change in your normal pattern of behavior are you experiencing right now? What's changed? Well, likely our work environment, our home life, our children's lives, even our finances. I'm sure for a lot of us. And we likely find ourselves wishing things were different, better, more of some things and less of other things. And we all experience it in our own way. And because of that, I won't tell you I know how you feel, because I don't know. I only know how I feel in my circumstances, and I won't compare my sense of loss to yours, because all grief is individual, just like every relationship we all have is unique. I feel my grief at 100%, and you likely experience your grief at 100%. So this brings us to two things to not do with somebody that's grieving, and that is do not compare losses, and don't tell them you know how they feel, because you don't. So if we can all agree that we are experiencing some grief, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that we are having a normal and natural reaction to loss. We are born knowing how to react and feel when we have a loss or grief. The bad news is, over the years, we've been socialized not to deal with grief. You see, we operate on belief systems, okay? And these belief systems are placed on us by well-meaning parents, adults, teachers, clergy, the media, sports heroes, anything like that. And they're usually well-meaning and done with love, but they give us the wrong tools, and it's only because they were given the wrong tools. They're only passing down generation to generation what they know. But when we grow up with these concepts, this negative programming, these belief systems about how to deal with grief, we accept them because we were kids and they came from an authority figure. So if that's the way mom acts when she has grief, well, that's how I'm supposed to act, right? So we accepted them. But here's the thing about belief systems that don't help propel you in your life. They can be labeled as BS. You see, we're taught how to attain things, not to do what we don't know what to do when we suffer a loss, because that reaction has been socialized out of us. You see, we've all been trying to paint a room with a hammer. We've just not had the right tools. Not only do we stink at addressing our own grief, but we are likely ill-prepared to help others deal with theirs. And a lot of that is because when we try to help somebody with grief, we're trying to give what's called intellectual advice. We're addressing the brain, not the heart. Okay? So grief exists in the heart, not in the brain. So because of this programming, these belief systems that in reality are BS, we end up having these misconceptions, these myths about dealing with grief. So think about when you were a child, or think about when you deal with your children, grandchildren. What if they come in and they're crying and they're sad? What do we say? Don't worry. Don't cry. What we're in fact telling them is don't feel bad. Don't have those normal, natural reactions. We're not supposed to show those. And what if the child is grieving over pet loss? A beloved dog passed away. What do we say? We say, don't worry, Timmy. On Saturday, we'll get you a new dog. What are we doing? Well, we're saying, again, don't feel bad. And then we're telling them to go replace the loss. That's going to fix everything. And it doesn't. I can tell you that when I was a freshman in high school, I had a huge crush, probably my first crush, on a wonderful girl. And we had 2 glorious weeks together. And then it ended. And I was crushed. I was very sad. And I know, I don't remember from who I heard it, but I know I heard, don't worry, there's plenty of fish in the sea. And it didn't help. What about grieve alone? If you're going to cry, go to your room. Guys, I know I've said that one. What about the old expression? Laugh and the whole world laughs with you. Cry and you cry alone. So we are taught to grieve alone. But then one of the problems is we then extrapolate that out as adults and we think everybody needs to grieve alone. What do we think? We go, give her some space. He needs to be alone. But it doesn't help. So let me ask this. In the last year, 5 years, 10 years, have you suffered a major loss? Pet loss, death of a loved one, a divorce? Has the grief truly gotten any better in a year, 5 years, 10 years? If the passage of time was going to help resolve grief, don't you think it would have been better after 5 years? The old expression, time heals all wounds, another BS belief system. So we're taught to just give it time and it'll pass. The passage of time does not help resolve grief. What is important is what you do within that time. Then there's a story that the writers of the books at the Grief Recovery Institute tell about a young mother who had 3 children and the husband and father died. And the mother called, she was confused, she didn't know, she just couldn't connect with her son. Every time she would try to address his grief with him, how are you doing? He'd say, I'm fine. No, really, I know you got to be sad. How are you doing? I'm fine, I said, and he'd run off into his bedroom. So she was asked, well, what do you do when the grief overcomes you? And she said, well, I run off to my bedroom because I got to be strong for the kids. And then the little light bulb went off, right? Her son was dealing with grief the way he saw an authority figure deal with it. He was trying to be strong for others. He didn't want to see others in the family watch him grieve. So when it comes to be strong for others, you have a choice. Do you want to be human or do you want to be strong? Real strength is the natural demonstration of emotion, being emotionally accurate. And when you do that, it sustains strength for all those other tasks you got to deal with when something like that happens. And then we're told to keep busy, right? So, you just need to keep busy. You got to fill your day. Well, this ties back to just give it time, doesn't it? Well, if you keep busy day by day, then time's going to pass and magically the grief will be better. No. Just give it time only makes one more day pass. It doesn't do anything to help you deal with the emotions of grief. It doesn't heal the broken heart. As one griever put it, no matter how busy I stay, at the end of my day, there's still a hole in my heart. So keep busy is another myth of grief. Because of these things, others are ill prepared to help us with grief. And guess what? Most of us are ill prepared to help others or ourselves. So here's why. We often say things that are well-meaning, but that can seem inappropriate. Like I said before, grief is from a broken heart, not a broken brain. Many of the things we say to a griever are meant for the intellect, the brain, but they don't resonate with the broken heart. They may be intellectually true, but they do nothing to help heal a broken heart where grief lies. So we run into these things. They don't know what to say. And after each one of these, you can change that to we. We don't know what to say. I was never comfortable with grief, mine or anybody else's. When I used to go to a funeral, and I'd go through the receiving line, I'd be like, I'm so sorry for your loss. You have my deepest condolences. That's all I had. I didn't know what else to say. I didn't want them breaking down in front of me, obviously, because I'm uncomfortable with that. So we don't know what to say. And then we might say something off the wall like, I know how you feel. And we're doing it well-meaning. We're doing it from a place of love, but Remember, we don't know how they feel because all losses, every relationship is unique. So here's an example. If your mother died and a week later my mother died, yes, we have parallel loss. But what if I had a wonderful, magical, loving, deep relationship with my mother? But on the other hand, what if the relationship you had with your mother was tumultuous? You know, you hated her as a kid and you never spoke to her as an adult. Do I know how you feel in your loss? No. And you certainly don't know how I feel with my loss. They are afraid of our feelings. And again, we are afraid of a griever's feelings. You see, we're taught from a very early age that having sad, painful, or negative feelings and showing them is somehow inappropriate. So as a society, we become uncomfortable when somebody's grieving and showing it. So what do we hear as kids? Big boys don't cry. Stop that crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. Forgive me, but I think I've said that one to kids. Every playground in the world, we hear cry baby, cry baby. And then as adults, we say things like, get a hold of yourself, keep a stiff upper lip, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And why do we say these things? One, we don't know what else to say or do, but two, we see those emotions coming and we were taught, no, we don't display those negative, sad, painful emotions. So we are uncomfortable even seeing that in somebody else. So then they try to change the subject. We try to change the subject. Here's an example. What if your favorite Uncle Joe died? You were very close to him and you run into a friend and your friend asks you, hey, how are you doing? I'm sorry. And you say, oh, I'm so sad. There's just a big hole in my heart. And your friend then replies, well-meaning and probably from a place of love, don't feel bad. He's not in pain anymore. Intellectually, that might be true. Doesn't speak to the heart because two subtle things just happened. First, they changed the subject away from you to the griever to the deceased. And as far as we know, the deceased did not experience grief. And the second thing that just happened is they are implying that the loved one is not suffering anymore, and therefore you shouldn't either. Interesting. Then they try to intellectualize. We try to intellectualize. A study showed that 4 out of 5 things a griever hears following a loss of a loved one implies that they should not deal with the emotions they are experiencing. What we hear applies to the intellect and not the emotions, not the heart. We say things like, the living must go on. He's in a better place. All things must pass. She lived a full life. You'll find somebody else. God will never give you more than you can handle. Intellectually, these things might be true and accurate. But again, the brain is not broken in grief, it's the heart. And we don't want to talk about death or loss. We have all these euphemisms for death. What do we say? We say things like, she's passed away, he's gone to his eternal rest, he's expired, he's gone, we've lost mother, things like that. They don't hear us. Read that as we don't hear them. Look, guys, grievers want to be heard. They want to share their story, but we're not good at listening because it's been socialized out of us. We get uncomfortable with those emotions. The fact that dealing with grief has been socialized out of us over the years. We're uncomfortable with their display and we don't know what to say. We're afraid of their feelings. We might try to change the subject. We might say intellectualize things. Now, this one I saved for last because this is where we can easily make a difference. So, since dealing with grief has been socialized out of us, what do we do with that emotional pressure? What do we do instead of addressing it? Here's another example. A little 4th grade girl, because in my experience, that's when the drama really starts. She comes home from school with tears and crying. She had a horrible day. She was picked on, bullied, whatever. And her mom says, honey, what's wrong? She goes, I had a horrible day at school. And the mom says, don't worry, i.e., don't feel bad. Here, have a cookie. Now, the mother is well-meaning and loving, But a cookie doesn't resolve the little girl's sadness. It doesn't resolve the grief, the issue at hand. It makes her feel different, but not better. And if anything else, it's a distraction. So from that example, we can extrapolate out that we learn to do all these other things instead of dealing with our grief. You see, we end up like a teapot over a high flame, but with a cork stuck in the spout. What's going to happen? The pressure builds up, right? That emotional pressure builds up, and you can see what's going to happen if the pressure doesn't get let off, if you don't loosen the cork a little bit. So to loosen the cork a little bit and let a little bit of steam and pressure out, we utilize what are called STIRBs, or short-term energy relieving behaviors. Now, STIRBs are classic behaviors we use to relieve the pressure of unresolved grief or loss. And they're very common things. Things like food, alcohol, drugs, smoking, anger, isolation, exercise, fantasy like movies, TV, books. Here's isolation. Isolation is a big one. It can be tough to get people to come to group grief recovery sessions because of the isolation. And we all tend to isolate in one way or another when we're grieving. Sex, workaholism, retail therapy, shopping. And then, at least in my case, what about prescription medicines? Like I said, it numbed me to the grief, but it didn't help. Now, for heaven's sakes, if you're taking a prescription medicine, don't change anything without talking to your medical provider. So, what about other things like scanning social media? I'm really good at mindless surfing on the internet, games on your phone, things like that. So it can be kind of an interesting exercise to sit down and write these out, and then write out what else you might be doing as a short-term energy relieving behavior. And sometimes that's just that awareness helps you have that aha moment that we all like to have. Now, most of these are not harmful in and of themselves, but if done for the wrong reasons or to excess, they can end up making things worse. And some of them are obvious how they would make things worse. But think about this. We're that teapot. We got the flame turned up high. We got a lot of steam, a lot of emotional pressure, but we got a cork in it. And by doing these things, we're letting just a tiny bit of steam out, but never enough. What if you have another major loss? What if you suffer a divorce, death of a loved one, or a pet loss even? Then what happens? That flame gets turned up, right? And unless you can completely pull that cork out, you're going to explode. And the problems with doing some of these to extreme are they can cause more stressors, more loss, more grief. So somebody uses retail therapy as a STIRB, then they could end up having financial problems. And financial problems are one of the things that can cause grief. Or excessive alcohol, drugs, workaholism, a relationship crumbles, and now you've got that problem. So these things used to extreme or for the wrong reasons can even make things worse. So time for more of my truth. My STIRBs was alcohol, and these have resolved now thanks to the grief recovery method. But alcohol was one of mine. I realized I'm not much of a drinker, but I realized I was having one drink almost every night, and sometimes 2 drinks. And if it was a crappy day, I'd have 3. And then exercise was a big one for me. I've always enjoyed going to the gym. It's a good stress reliever for me after work, and then I feel good and I'm ready to have a good rest of the evening. But my exercise took on some different sub-elements. There was a lot of anger behind it, a lot of urgency. Do not get in my way. I'm going to the gym. I don't care if supper's on the table. I got to go work out. And I was going every night, tearing up my body. Cortisol levels were probably off the charts, and I did not feel good, but I felt like I had to do it. And that also has resolved. And then for me, like I said, prescription medications that didn't seem to help me. And again, if you're taking a prescription medicine, don't change anything without talking to your medical provider. There's 3 major problems with these STIRBs. First, they work, or more accurately, they appear to work. They create the illusion of grief recovery by making you forget or bury your emotions. And second, they're short-term. short-term energy relieving behaviors. They don't last. They don't pull the cork all the way out of the spout, and they don't deal with the emotional issues. And third, they do nothing to remove the cork. The pressure still builds up. So what can we do to make a difference for the loved ones in our lives right now? Well, first of all, this knowledge you've just gotten can be a huge help. So do this for your loved ones, your family, and do this for those in your care. Even if you run into somebody, a stranger that you see is grieving, you can do this for them. It's a resource you can have and share with somebody from a good place. Do you remember they don't hear us or we don't hear them? This is where we can make a huge difference. So first aid for a broken heart, listen. Listen like a big heart with only ears. When we do our grief recovery group sessions, we put a big old picture of a big heart with big goofy ears on it. And we explain to the other grievers in the group, listen, we just listen. If they laugh, if the griever laughs, you can laugh with them. If they cry, you can cry with them, but you just listen. You do not try to fix them. Grievers don't need to be fixed by other people. They need to fix themselves. You don't compare losses with them. You don't hand them tissues. Because what's that imply? Here's some tissues, dry up those tears, I'm getting uncomfortable. No, they want tissues. There's probably tissues in their pocket or their purse or something. They can get them. You don't need to hand them tissues. You don't pat them on the leg or hold their hand or anything. Just listen. And the next step or an additional thing you can do is ask. You can ask what happened. So not too long ago, I had a lady come see me and she said, my mother died last night. And I said, what happened? And I listened. And then later, when that part of it settled down, I said, what was her name? And you know what I did? I listened. And I said, tell me about your mother. And what did I do? I listened. And then I asked her, I said, what's your favorite memory of your mom? And the person got a smile and the tears dried up for a short time. And she told me this funny story and she laughed and I laughed. And she gave me a beautiful gift just because I opened up with her, right? And I made it a safe place. I let her know I would listen. And she shared all these wonderful things with me. So listen like a heart with big ears. Then, these can be adapted as needed. So what I would do right now, if I ran into you and we're all still in this shutdown, this lockdown, or you had some other loss, I would say, tell me about what you miss the most with being under these stay-at-home orders. And you would probably open up and tell me some things. I apologize for the dogs. It sounds like the male's here. So the next thing we can do is we can elicit emotions. I call these emotion eliciting questions. So imagine that we all just scratch the surface of our emotions. Hey, how you doing today? Oh, I'm fine, living the dream. It's probably a lie. There's probably some things going on, but that's what we're taught. That's how we do it, right? We don't share those sad, painful emotions. So if you imagine, it's like we all have this big walk-in closet. It's dimly lit. There's tons of shelves, and we have all our deeper, true emotions on these shelves, dust covered because we never access them, we never use them. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask if they are experiencing a certain emotion, and you can just take a guess. But you ask it to make sure it's like a question. You say, allow your tone of voice to rise at the end, kind of like I did at the very beginning of this video. And you want to do that so it's obvious that you're asking a question. So you might say to someone that you know has some kind of grief thing going on, you would say, are you feeling abandoned? And they might reply, abandoned? Yeah, a little bit. But really, what I'm feeling is fear. I'm scared because now I've got to do this and this and this. So they go in that closet, they rummage around, and they pull out a deeper, more self-true emotion for them. Or you could ask, like, are you experiencing hopelessness? No, it's not really hopelessness. It's, it's excitement and anxiety at the same time because now I've got to, things like that. So you ask them and then you listen. And then finally, guilt is a very heavy burden. If you can lift the guilt off of someone's back, you're doing them a huge favor. And I think we tend to hear this a lot when there's been, a sudden loss due to an accident, a suicide, or something like that. That's usually when I've heard this is somebody feels guilt because they did or didn't do something. But what you can point out to that person is the definition of guilt is that it arises from an action taken or not taken with the intent to harm. So ask them, are you sure it's guilt? Because if there was no intent to harm, by definition, that's not guilt. Well, no, I had no intention to harm them. Well, then maybe what you're feeling is regret. Because regret is wishing that things were done differently or better. So remember this, guilt is often regret mislabeled, okay? And that's a huge one you can do for people. So what can we do? This is just kind of a quick summary. Listen. If you have a child or someone in your life or a stranger even that's grieving, just listen like a big heart with only ears. Don't try to fix them. Don't compare losses. Don't tell them how they feel, because you don't. Don't hand them tissues. And then you can ask, what happened? And then you listen. What was their name? And then you listen. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about Uncle Joe. And then you listen. And what is your favorite memory of that person? Or what's the favorite memory of your marriage? What's the favorite memory of your dog? Things like that. And then we can use the emotion eliciting questions. And it can be kind of fun to sit down and try to write out all the emotions that you can come up with. Abandoned, helplessness, fearful, anxiety, stressed, afraid, sad, happy, anything. Write them down. Have some of these in your mental hip pocket so you can elicit some emotions and help the griever go a little bit deeper into that closet and come out with the right ones. And then, of course, remove guilt. It's that simple. And you just have to learn to listen. And because you don't have to fix anything, you don't have to compare losses, you don't have to hand them tissues, you just have to listen and maybe ask some, appropriate questions. You will be much more comfortable with grief and go back to what we knew as children, that it's a normal and natural reaction and that it's okay. And we need to get it out. So the grief recovery method that this talk is based on, they got a great website, and it's griefrecoverymethod.com. They have tons of resources. They have ebook downloads that are free. They sell their own books on the website. They have lots of resources for anybody. Now, if you or somebody else is experiencing grief and you need help right now, check out the Grief Recovery website. They do have a handful of specialists that have additional training that can do one-on-one online training like a Zoom or a Skype meeting. The rest of us, until the pandemic is over and the stay-at-home orders are lifted, we've been asked not to do groups and one-on-one, understandably. But as Grief Recovery Method specialists, we do group grief recovery. And we can do that at our office or at your location, whether it's a church, a funeral home, a business, anything like that. We can do one-on-one grief recovery. We can do pet loss grief recovery. And we can do helping children with loss. And I think after this talk, you've probably seen just how important that is. And as a reminder, we do not work directly with children, but we can help educate you adults, teachers, parents, coaches, anybody that has children under their care. Now, the Grief Recovery Institute has several books, but these are kind of the two big ones. There's also one for pet loss. I didn't put it up here. The Grief Recovery Handbook, we call it the Purple Book. It's good for one-on-one grief recovery and the group grief recovery. And When Children Grieve, I think, is a really, really good book. And so be sure to check that out. And off the record, you can probably get them at Amazon a few bucks cheaper than you can on the Institute's website. So my name's Eric Van Fossen, my partner, Summer Shaw. We're both certified grief recovery specialists. This is a completely separate skill set from our hypnosis practice. We have a separate website for it. Two separate things. They don't cross back and forth, just to be clear. Our website is DaytonGriefRecovery.com. Our email is action@DaytonGriefRecovery.com, and there's our phone number. If you have any questions, if you have concerns, if you want to know when our next group is, if you want to know when we're going to be back up and doing groups and seeing one-on-ones, call us, email us, anything like that. So we're glad to help. Go out there and help your loved ones get through these normal and natural reactions that we're all having. And, you know, if you run into a stranger, you're prepared. So God bless and thank you so much. And be sure to let us know if there's anything we can do for you. Thank you.